The night was quiet yet heavy with smoke rising above the dark trees, and the human walked alone through the forest, holding only a small pack on his shoulder, his boots pressing soft earth and his eyes fixed on the strange orange glow ahead. His breath grew faster as the air turned bitter and filled with ash. And he knew something terrible had happened there, and his heart began to pound with fear and curiosity together. He pushed aside broken branches and stepped into a clearing. And there, in the middle, lay a ship broken and burned, its metal torn apart like paper and flames still licking the edges. The human froze for a moment, staring at the wreck. The smell of fire and death hung in the air, and the silence was broken only by the crackle of burning scraps. He wanted to turn away, yet something inside pulled him closer. Step by step, among the black smoke, he heard a sound faint and weak like the cry of a child. His chest tightened and he moved quickly, climbing over broken pieces of metal, his eyes scanning every shadow, his ears sharp, and then he saw her, an alien woman crawling out from under a collapsed beam, her skin pale with ash, her hair tangled and her body trembling. She held tightly a small bundle against her chest, and the sound came again, the cry of a baby, muffled but desperate. The human stopped, his breath stuck in his throat. He had seen many things in war and travel, but this sight made his heart heavy. The woman looked up, her eyes wide, filled with fear and distrust. She pressed the baby closer as if to shield it from him. Her lips moved, but no words came, only the shaking of her head. She believed he was a danger, perhaps a killer. He slowly raised his hands to show he had no weapon. His voice calm. Though his throat was dry, he whispered words of peace. Though he knew she might not understand, still his tone was soft like wind through leaves. He took a step forward, and the alien widow pulled back, her body weak, but her will strong, her baby crying, louder in the smoky night. The fire around them grew stronger and sparks flew into the sky. The human felt the heat pressing against his skin. He knew they could not stay here long. The ship was breaking, more pieces, falling, and the flames spreading. He looked at the woman and then at the baby, and he knew he could not walk away. He dropped his pack to the ground and pulled out a flask of water. He set it slowly near her feet, then stepped back, waiting. The widow stared at the flask. Her lips cracked, her eyes red. She hesitated, her hands shaking. She glanced at the human, then at her crying baby. Finally, with trembling fingers, she reached forward and took the water. She drank only a little, then gave the rest to the tiny mouth of her child. The baby quieted just a little, and the human felt a breath of relief. Still, the fear in her eyes did not fade. She kept distance, her body tense. The human lowered himself to the ground, sitting cross-legged to appear smaller. He wanted her to see. He would not harm her. He picked up a piece of cloth from his pack and dipped it in water, then gently laid it near her, pointing to the wounds on her arm. She understood, slowly pressed the cloth against her skin, and winced. The fire roared louder. The ship groaned, and the night air shook with the sound of collapsing metal. The human stood and looked around. He knew they must move quickly or all would be lost. He gestured to the trees, to the path leading away from the flames, his eyes begging her to trust him. She hesitated, holding her baby tight, her body swaying from weakness. Then finally, with tears on her cheeks, she nodded once, very slowly. The human stepped closer, his hand ready not to take but to guide. He helped her to her feet. She almost fell but leaned on his arm. Her baby pressed to her chest. The three of them moved away from the burning ship, their figures small against the wide, dark forest behind them. The glow of fire lit their path like a cruel torch. As they disappeared into the trees, the human felt a strange weight in his heart, not of burden but of duty. He did not know who she was or where she came from, only that she was a widow with a child left alone beside a wreck, and that now he could not let them go. They were in his care, and the night ahead would test them all. The forest was dark and alive with sounds as the human led the alien widow and her baby away from the burning wreck. The fire behind them was fading into distance, but the smell of smoke still followed heavy in the air. The human walked slowly so she could keep pace, her body weak and trembling with every step. The baby whimpered softly, hidden in her arms, and the sound echoed in the silence of the trees like a fragile song. The night grew, colder, and the stars above glimmered between branches. The human searched for a place safe enough to rest his eyes, sharp scanning every shadow. He found a small clearing surrounded by thick bushes and fallen logs, and there he decided to stop, gathered dry branches and struck sparks with flint until a fire flickered to life, sending a soft glow around them. The widow pulled back, at first clutching her baby tightly. The flames reminded her of the ship, the screams, the loss, but the human spoke gently, pointing to the warmth and safety. And finally she sat down, still distant but less afraid. The human placed food from his pack on a cloth, dried meat and bread. Though simple, it was all he had. He set it near her, then stepped back again, to show no threat. She hesitated, her stomach tight with hunger, yet her pride and fear stronger still. The baby cried louder, its tiny body shaking from cold and hunger. The widow's hands shook as she looked at the human, then at the food. Finally, she tore a small piece and pressed it into the child's mouth. Silence fell as the baby fed. The widow's eyes glistened with tears, but she herself did not eat. The human leaned closer, gently offering another piece. He pointed to her and nodded. She frowned, but at last hunger broke her wall. She ate in silence, never taking her eyes from him. The fire crackled and shadows danced around them. Predators in the forest growled faintly, distant yet near enough to remind them of danger. The human tightened his grip on a wooden branch, sharpened into a spear, ready if anything came close. The baby fell asleep in her arms, and the widow rocked slowly, whispering words in a language unknown. Her voice filled with grief and love. The human listened. Though he understood nothing, he felt the weight of her loss, the loneliness that hung heavy like smoke. She had lost family, friends, perhaps her whole world in that burning wreck, and now she was here with only a child and a stranger. Suddenly a howl cut through the night, sharp and long. The widow stiffened, clutching the baby tighter, her eyes wide with terror. The human stood at once, holding the spear, his body tense. The sound came again from deeper in the trees, and then movement in the shadows. Glowing eyes watching from the dark. Wolves or something worse. The human threw more wood into the fire, flames rising higher, and the creatures hesitated, their eyes retreating a little but not gone. The widow whispered urgently, her voice shaking. She feared the fire would draw them closer. But the human shook his head, pointing to the flames. He knew the beasts feared light. He stood tall in front of them, guarding with his body. The widow watched him, her fear now mixed with something new, a small spark of trust. She saw how he placed himself between danger and her without hesitation, as if her life and the life of her child mattered to him. The night dragged slowly. The creatures circled, but never dared enter the firelight. The human did not rest. His eyes stayed open, ears sharp, ready to strike if they dared. At times he turned to look at the widow and saw her eyes watching him, not with the same sharp fear as before, but with a softer gaze, tired yet curious, as though she wondered why a human would do this for her. Hours passed until at last the growls faded into distance and silence returned, broken only by the crackle of fire and the soft breath of the sleeping child. The human let out a long breath of relief, but did not sleep. Still he stayed awake, guarding until the first pale light of dawn touched the sky above. The widow, too, had not slept fully. She leaned against a log, her eyes heavy, yet she held her baby close, her gaze often drifting to the man who stood guard like stone. When morning came, the human placed more food near her, and this time she did not hesitate. She ate slowly, sharing with her baby, then looked at him, her lips moving, though he could not understand her words. Her tone was softer, almost grateful. She touched her chest, then pointed at him, a gesture of question, perhaps asking who he was. He gave his name slowly, repeating it so she might learn. She listened, then tried to echo the sound, though it came broken and strange. Still, it made the human smile. The day ahead was uncertain, the forest wide, the dangers many, but something had changed in the long night. The widow no longer looked at him, only with fear, her eyes still wary, but there was also a fragile thread of trust forming between them, a thread thin yet strong enough to hold them together as they faced what lay ahead. And the human knew this was only the beginning of their journey. The sun rose slowly above the forest, its golden light falling on damp leaves and broken branches. The human stretched his arms, weary from a night without rest. his eyes still sharp as he watched the alien widow and her baby. The woman looked weak, her face pale yet her spirit strong. She held the baby close, whispering soft sounds in her strange tongue. The human knew they could not stay in the clearing. Danger was everywhere, and the burned ship might draw hunters or soldiers. He packed his few belongings and gestured to her, pointing toward the rising sun and the path that led deeper into the unknown. She hesitated, fear heavy in her eyes, but she understood survival meant movement. She rose slowly, carrying the baby, her legs trembling. The human walked ahead, clearing the way with his spear cutting through thorn branches and listening for every sound. The forest was alive with birds, insects, and distant growls. Each step felt like a risk, yet turning back was not an option. The path grew rough, stones and roots twisting underfoot. The widow stumbled more than once, her arms aching from carrying the baby. The human turned back each time, steadying her with his hand, though she pulled away quickly, not ready yet to accept his help. Still, the baby cried from hunger and weakness, and she could not hide her tears. The human stopped, opened his pack, and offered the last of his bread. He broke it into small pieces so the baby could swallow tiny bits. The widow's eyes filled with water as she took the food, her lips moving in words that sounded like thanks, though broken by grief. They walked for hours, the sun climbing high, the heat pressing heavy. The widow's steps grew slower, her strength fading. The baby whimpered in her arms. The human noticed her swaying dangerously. He knew she would fall if she continued. He dropped his pack to the ground and stepped close. He pointed at her, then at the baby, then at his own back, showing she could let him carry one. She shook her head, fiercely clutching the child tighter, but her knees buckled and she fell to the ground, holding the baby so tightly it cried louder. The human knelt beside her, his voice calm, his eyes steady. He placed his spear down to show trust and extended his arms. She looked at him, trembling with exhaustion and fear, but the child's cries broke her will at last. She let the human take the baby, his rough hands gentle as he lifted the small body and held it against his chest. The baby quieted almost at once, as though sensing safety. The widow stared, her mouth open in disbelief and relief together. The human carried the baby in one arm and helped the widow stand with the other. They continued slowly, his strength carrying them forward. He felt the tiny heartbeat against his chest, and something stirred inside him. A strange warmth, not duty alone, but a bond forming like invisible thread. The widow walked beside him, unsteady yet calmer. Watching every move he made, her eyes no longer filled, only with fear but also with questions. The forest path led them to a river, its water clear and fast. The human knew they must cross, though the current was strong. He looked at the widow, her face pale at the thought. She shook her head, afraid for the child. He nodded firmly, stepped into the shallow edgewater, cold against his legs. He held the baby high above as he moved carefully. The widow followed, gripping his arm with all her strength. Her eyes closed as the water rose to her waist. The current pushed hard, but the human stood steady, his muscles straining until they reached the other side, soaked and shaking. But alive, the widow gasped, clutching her baby back into her arms, pressing kisses to its tiny head, her tears mixing with river water. She looked at the human, her lips trembling as if words long held back were ready to spill. But still she remained silent. They rested under a fallen tree. The human gathered branches and made a small fire to dry their clothes. The widow sat close this time, not far away. The baby slept against her chest. She glanced at the human again and again, as if measuring his soul, and finally she touched her chest, spoke a word slowly, clearly, perhaps her name. He repeated the sound, awkward. But, Ernest? She nodded and then pointed at him, her eyes asking. He gave his name. She tried to speak it, stumbling yet smiling faintly. The day stretched long and the road ahead promised more trials, but something had changed in the shadows of the forest. The alien widow had let him carry her child. She had leaned on his strength, and he had risked his life to bring them across the river. The bond between them, though fragile, had begun to grow like a small fire. In cold night, the human knew the journey was far from over. Danger still hunted them. Enemies might still follow. But in his heart he felt a new resolve, stronger than before. He would not abandon them. He would carry them forward no matter what waited beyond the trees. The forest grew darker, as the day turned to night clouds covering the moon and leaving only shadows to guide their path. The human walked with quiet steps. His spear in hand, his eyes scanning every corner, the alien widow followed close, holding her baby against her chest, her breath uneven, her face pale with exhaustion, yet her spirit unbroken. The baby stirred from time to time, letting out soft cries that seemed far too loud in the silence of the night. The human knew they were not alone. He had seen broken branches, fresh footprints too heavy to be from animals, and heard faint echoes of voices carried by the wind soldiers, perhaps searching for survivors from the wreck. The widow seemed to sense it too, her hands tightening on the baby, her eyes wide with fear, each step heavier as though the very air pressed against her chest. The human raised his hand, signaling her to stop. He crouched low, listening carefully, and in the distance he saw them, figures moving through the trees, their armor faintly shining, in the weak light their weapons drawn. The widow gasped softly and pulled back. The baby whimpered. The human quickly placed a finger to his lips, a silent command for silence. He guided her toward a cluster of rocks covered with thick vines. He pushed the branches aside, making space, and gestured for her to hide. She shook her head at first, unwilling to leave him exposed. But the baby cried again, louder, and he pressed her shoulder firmly, urging her to move. She slipped inside the cover, clutching her child as the human stood outside, spear-ready eyes fixed on the approaching shadows. The soldiers moved closer, their boots crunching the leaves, their voices harsh, speaking in a tongue the human only partly understood. He caught words like survivor, prisoner, and search. His chest tightened. He knew if they found the widow and her baby, they would be taken or killed. He gripped his spear tighter, sweat forming on his brow. Though the night air was cool, the soldiers passed within only a few steps, their faces hidden behind dark visors, their weapons glowing faintly. They stopped suddenly, one of them pointing to the fire marks on the ground, the ashes from their last camp still visible. The human cursed himself silently for not covering the traces. One soldier knelt, touched the ground, and raised his head to signal the others. They spread out, searching every shadow, their eyes glowing red in the dark. The human's heart pounded. He knew if they came closer, they would find the widow. He had only one choice. He picked up a stone and threw it hard into the forest far to the left. The sound cracked loud against a tree. The soldiers spun at once, their weapons raised. They shouted and rushed toward the noise, their heavy steps shaking the ground. The human wasted no moment. He turned to the widow, pulling her out from the hiding place, her eyes wide with confusion. He whispered urgently, pointing to the opposite side of the forest, urging her to move quickly. She clutched the baby close and followed, her legs weak yet driven by fear. They slipped through the trees, silent and fast, the shadows of the soldiers fading behind them as the false trail drew them away. Still, the danger was not gone. The human led them deeper until the night became heavy with fog and the trees twisted like dark fingers. He stopped, finally kneeling to let the widow catch her breath. She sank to the ground, holding her child, tears falling freely, her body shaking from fear and exhaustion. The human placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his eyes steady, his voice calm though soft. She looked at him, her lips trembling as though she wished to speak, but only a faint sound came. The baby stirred, then fell quiet again, lulled by the rhythm of her heart. The human gathered branches again, but this time he did not dare make fire. The light would betray them. Instead, he wrapped them in his cloak, sitting close to shield them from the cold. The widow leaned against him, not out of choice, but out of need, her body too tired to resist. She pressed her baby between them, the warmth spreading through the small space they shared in the darkness. Hours passed slowly, every sound magnified, every crack of twig making them flinch. The human never closed, his eyes, his spear resting across his knees, his ears open to the night. The widow too remained half awake, her head against his shoulder, her breath shallow. She watched him silently, her fear slowly changing into something else. Trust perhaps, or gratitude. She had seen how he risked himself to save her again and again, how he faced soldiers without thought of his own safety. When the dawn finally touched the edge of the sky, the human rose, stretching his stiff body. He looked at the widow and her baby. Both still resting, he felt a strange heaviness in his chest. Not of weariness, but of responsibility. He knew now that their survival depended not only on strength, but also on the bond growing between them. He reached out gently, waking her. She blinked, her eyes heavy yet alert. He pointed to the rising sun and the path ahead. She nodded slowly, holding the baby tighter. And together they began walking again. The shadows of enemies still lingered behind them, their voices echoing faint though distant. But the human knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. The path ahead promised more danger. Yet in his heart, he carried a vow he would protect them no matter what, even if it meant standing against the world itself. The sky turned black before noon as heavy clouds rolled across the horizon, carrying thunder and sparks of lightning that lit the forest in flashes. The human felt the air grow heavy, the smell of rain mixed with smoke, and he knew a storm unlike any other was coming. The alien widow walked close, holding her baby tightly, her face pale, her body trembling as the wind howled through the trees, leaves tearing free and spinning in the air. The first drops of rain fell sharp and cold, striking their skin like needles. Then the downpour began, sudden and fierce, water pouring from the sky, flooding the path beneath their feet. The human pulled his cloak around the widow and her baby, shielding them as best he could. Yet the storm grew stronger. Lightning split the sky with deafening roars, thunder rolling through the earth itself. The baby cried loudly, frightened by the chaos. The widow clutched the child and whispered, broken words trying to soothe her. But her own tears mixed with rain. They searched desperately for shelter, the human guiding them through mud and rushing water. His boots sinking with every step, branches snapped above as the wind tore trees apart. The widow stumbled more than once, her strength nearly gone. The human caught her each time, steadying her and pulling her forward. Finally, he spotted a small hollow beneath a cliff, where the rocks bent outward, forming a shallow cave. He hurried them inside, pressing them against the cold stone while the storm raged outside. For a moment they thought they were safe, but then lightning struck a nearby tree, splitting it in half. Flames burst out, carried by the windfire, spreading across the wet ground, as if the storm itself carried both water and flame. The widow screamed, clutching her baby as burning branches fell near the cave. The human grabbed his spear and struck at the flames, pushing them aside. His hands burned his face, cut by sparks, yet he did not stop. He built a barrier of wet earth and rocks, trying to block the fire from reaching them. The widow cried out again, her voice breaking as the baby slipped from her arms for only a second, and the rushing water outside pulled the child. Toward the fire, the human leapt without thought. His heart racing, he threw himself into the flood, his arms reaching through smoke and heat, until his hands closed around the tiny body. He lifted the baby high against his chest, shielding it with his own body as flames licked his arms. He stumbled back into the cave, gasping for breath, the child crying. But alive, the widow fell to her knees, grabbing the baby from him, pressing it to her chest, sobbing with relief. The human sank against the rock, his chest heaving, his clothes soaked and burned, his hands shaking from pain. The widow looked at him through tears, her eyes wide with something more than fear. Now it was gratitude, deep and raw. Her lips trembled as if to speak, but no words. Came only her gaze, heavy with meaning. She reached out her free hand, touching his shoulder lightly, a gesture small yet filled with trust. The storm raged on for hours, water flooding the ground, fire still crackling where lightning struck. The human sat at the cave's mouth, watching the chaos, guarding against danger, while the widow huddled deeper inside, rocking her baby to sleep. Her voice soft, her song broken yet soothing, even against thunder. The human listened, his body aching, yet his spirit alive. He felt something shift inside him, as if the bond between them had grown stronger, forged not by choice but by survival. When at last the storm began to weaken, the rain slowed and the fire outside smoldered into smoke. The human rose to his feet, his legs stiff, his arms sore. He looked out across the forest, now scarred trees, blackened earth, steaming puddles glowing faintly from heat. The world seemed changed, broken yet alive. He turned back to the widow. Her eyes met his, and for the first time she did not look away. They stepped from the cave together, the baby held tightly between them. the human leading the way across fallen logs and steaming ground. The widow close behind, no longer resisting his guidance. Her steps light but determined, the air still heavy with smoke, yet the path ahead clearer than before. The storm had tested them, nearly destroyed them, yet it had also bound them stronger. As they walked, the widow touched her chest, then pointed at the baby, then at the human. Her lips moving slowly, forming sounds of her language, her meaning clear. Even if the words were strange, she was telling him they were one now. Not strangers, not enemies, but something closer. Something like family. The human felt his chest tighten. With emotion he nodded slowly, his voice steady as he spoke his own words, though she might not understand his tone. Carried the truth. He would protect them. He would not leave them. The night returned quiet after the storm, stars peeking through broken clouds. The human built a small fire, this time safe among stones, and the widow did not flinch. She sat close beside him, her baby asleep across her lap, her body leaning lightly against his shoulder. Together they watched the flames, their faces lit by gentle glow. The danger had not ended. The road ahead still dark with enemies, yet for the first time hope stirred in their hearts, stronger than fear. And in that moment, they were no longer only survivors. They were becoming a family. The forest opened at last after days of endless walking and storms behind them. The human stood at the edge of a wide valley where broken paths wound through tall grass and scattered stones. And far below lay the remains of an old village, its houses half collapsed, its walls covered with vines. The widow gasped softly, clutching her baby tighter, her eyes wide with both fear and hope. The human studied the sight carefully, his hand gripping his spear, his heart cautious, for though the place looked abandoned, danger often hid in silence. They descended slowly, the wind carrying the scent of old ashes and forgotten lives. The village lay quiet, but signs of life still lingered, faint trails of smoke drifting from a single chimney, prints fresh in the mud. Near a well, the human raised his hand, signaling the widow to wait. He stepped forward, scanning corners, every shadow holding secrets, his breath heavy with suspicion. Then he saw movement, a figure darting between ruined houses, small, quick and cautious. He froze, watching the shadow slip away. The widow whispered something, her voice trembling. She wanted to turn back, yet the baby cried softly, needing rest and food. The human shook his head firmly, pointing to the village. They had little choice. They needed shelter, supplies, and perhaps answers. He guided her forward step by step, his eyes always moving, spear ready. The houses loomed like broken teeth and doors creaked in the wind. At last they reached the center of the village, where a cracked fountain stood covered in moss. The widow sat on a stone to rest her baby, feeding softly, while the human circled, scanning the area. He found old tools, broken pots, and scraps of cloth left behind by long-gone families. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He spun his spear, raised only to find an old alien man standing there, his body bent with age, his skin marked with scars, his eyes sharp despite his years. The widow gasped, recognizing something familiar in the elder's face, perhaps of her kind. Perhaps from her lost world. She rose weakly, calling out words. The old man's eyes softened. He stepped closer, though his gait was slow. The human kept his spear ready, distrust heavy in his chest. But the widow touched his arm, whispering softly, urging calm. The old man spoke in a rough voice, words the human did not know, but the widow answered quickly, tears filling her eyes as she clutched the baby to her chest. The elder listened, nodded, then looked at the human, his gaze steady. Hard to read, he stepped closer, studying the man with eyes like fire. The human stood firm, spear at his side, his breath strong. The elder lifted his hand in a gesture of peace, then pointed to the broken houses and the chimney still carrying smoke. He motioned for them to follow and slowly led the way. They entered a small shelter built from stone and patched with wood. Inside was warmth, a fire burning low, herbs hanging from the walls, a smell of stew filling the air. The widow nearly collapsed with relief, sitting down at once, the baby in her lap. The elder brought bowls of food and water, placing them gently before her. She ate slowly, carefully, feeding the baby first, then herself, her eyes shining with gratitude. The human, however, did not eat, his eyes still sharp, his body tense. He did not trust kindness so quickly in this world. He asked questions, though his words were not understood. His tone was clear. The elder raised his hands, showing he meant no harm, then pointed to the mountains beyond the valley, his voice heavy with warning. The human listened, catching fragments through the widow's broken translation, words like patrols, soldiers, danger, and hunt. It became clear the village was not entirely abandoned but hidden. Scattered survivors lived here, clinging to old ruins and hiding from those who sought them. The elder explained through gestures that soldiers had been searching the valley for wreckage and survivors, that their enemies would soon return. The human felt his chest tighten. The storm of fire had passed, but another storm was rising, one of blades and soldiers. That night they stayed in the elder's shelter, the widow sleeping close to her baby. At last, her body finding peace. In warmth, the human sat near the fire, his spear across his knees, his mind restless. He stared into the flames, his heart heavy with the choice before him. They could stay here, risk discovery and death, or leave again into the wilderness with no direction, yet safer in the shadows. The elder sat beside him, silent for a long time, then spoke slowly, pointing at the widow, then at the baby, then at the human, his voice deep, carrying weight. The human did not understand the words yet. He felt the meaning in the way the old eyes burned into his own, a message of responsibility, of bond, of destiny. The human lowered his gaze, then looked at the sleeping widow and child, his chest tight with unspoken vow. The night grew deeper. The fire crackled, and outside, the wind carried whispers of enemies moving closer, unseen. The human gripped his spear tighter, his resolve like stone. He knew tomorrow would bring another trial, one that could not be avoided, one that would test not only his strength, but the fragile family he had sworn to protect. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind through ruined walls. The human sat near the fire, his spear across his knees, his eyes watching the shadows. The widow slept close to her baby, her arms wrapped tightly around the child, her breath uneven from worry, though her body needed rest. The old elder, too, had dozed by the door. Yet the human did not close his eyes. He felt the danger drawing near like storm clouds before lightning, and then it came, boots striking the ground outside, voices harsh and loud, the sound of metal clashing together. The soldiers had returned their search, leading them to the hidden village. The human stood at once, waking the elder with a shake of his arm. The widow stirred, eyes wide with fear, as the baby began to cry. The human pressed a finger to his lips, urging silence, then gestured for them to hide in the back corner of the shelter. The widow obeyed, clutching her baby as the elder moved beside her. The human stood tall, spear ready, his body tense, his heart steady. The door burst open, wood splintering as soldiers rushed inside, their armor glinting in the firelight, their weapons raised. The human did not wait. He lunged forward, spear striking the first soldier in the chest, forcing him back. The clash was loud. The widow covered her baby's ears, tears streaming down her face as the fight began. The small shelter filled with smoke dust and the roar of battle. The human fought with the strength of desperation, his movements sharp, fast, his body driven not by rage but by purpose. Every strike meant to keep danger away from the widow and her child. He blocked blades with his spear, thrusting, pushing, kicking, his body bruised, cut, yet unyielding. The soldiers were many, but the fire inside him burned stronger than their numbers. He shouted words of defiance, though they may not understand the meaning. The sound carried the weight of unbreakable will. The elder too joined, though his body was frail. He grabbed a fallen tool, striking one soldier across the face, buying the human precious moments. The widow cried out from the corner, begging in her tongue, though her voice carried only fear. The baby screamed, yet the human heard it like a call that fueled his arms with strength greater than pain. More soldiers pressed inside the small shelter, shaking under the weight of the battle. The human pushed them back step by step, until at last he burst outside into the open street, forcing the fight away from the widow. The rain had begun to fall again, the ground slick with mud and blood, the sky flashing with lightning as if the heavens themselves watched the clash. The soldiers circled, blades gleaming, but the human stood tall, spear steady, his breath heavy, his eyes burning. He fought like a storm. Each movement precise, each strike a vow. He would not fall. He would not let them take the widow or her child. The soldiers shouted to each other, trying to overwhelm him, yet one by one, They fell driven back by his resolve. His body bled. His arms ached, but his heart held him firm. He was more than one man. He was shield, protector, guardian of those who had no one else. The widow crawled to the door, watching with eyes wide, her heart breaking at the sight of his wounds, her lips moving as she prayed to the stars above. She whispered his name, though her voice trembled. Her baby quieted as if sensing the weight of the moment. The elder dragged her back, urging her to stay hidden, but her gaze never left the human fighting in the storm. At last only one soldier remained, the leader, taller, stronger, his armor dark, his blade sharp. He stepped forward, challenging the human. The two clashed under thunder and rain, the sound echoing. Through the valley, sparks flying with every strike. The human stumbled from exhaustion, yet rose again, each time his body breaking but his will unbroken. He thought of the widow, her tears, her voice, her child's cry, and every thought gave him strength he did not know he had. With one final strike, he drove his spear into the ground, forcing the soldier back, and with a cry that shook the night, he ended the battle. The last enemy fell silent, spreading across the ruined village, broken only by the sound of rain falling softly. The human staggered, breathing hard, his body trembling, his spear broken in half. The widow rushed to him, her baby in her arms, her tears falling freely. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hand to his chest, her lips moving in words of thanks, words of love. Though the human could not understand the language, her meaning was clear. He looked at her, his breath shallow, yet steady, his eyes filled with warmth and pride. He reached out, touching the baby's tiny hand, then her face, his voice soft as he whispered that they were safe now. The elder stood behind them, his old eyes wet with tears. He bowed his head deeply in respect for the human who had given everything for lives, not his own. The rain washed away the blood and smoke, leaving only the bond forged in fire and battle. The widow leaned close, holding her baby and resting her head against his shoulder. Together they sat in the quiet dawn as light broke over the valley. In that moment, the human knew he had found a new purpose, not as wanderer, not as soldier, but as protector of a family bound not by blood but by choice. And in their eyes he saw not fear but trust, not despair but hope. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, they would walk it together, stronger than storm, stronger than war, stronger than fate itself.